Welcome to the HITea with Grace podcast, where we spill the tea on HIT. Today I'm here at ASCO, the world's largest oncology conference, and I'm honored to welcome to the pod Dr. Rebecca Feldman, VP of Biomarker and Drug Intelligence at Caris. Thanks for joining me, Rebecca.
Thank you, Grace, for having us.
So tell me about the career path that brought you to Caris.
So when I first joined and when I graduated in 2008 with my PhD in cancer biology, the career paths for PhD students there were not a lot of options, right? So it's either academia and go get your postdoc or a lot of unknowns. So at that time, there were limited postdocs that interested me. So I came across a job description that really enticed me, which was to find out as much as I could about a biomarker and a drug in a certain cancer type. And I was hooked. And that's how my story goes.
That's amazing. So tell me, what is a biomarker?
A biomarker is something in the body that is a flag for the status of a disease or a gene or anything in the body that needs to be distinguished from normal and not normal. So that's what a biomarker is.
Interesting. So we've heard a little bit about ASCO, about new cancer targets like CLDN18, especially in hard to treat cancers like pancreatic. Why is finding these targets so important, and how does Caris help researchers and physicians figure out which patients might benefit from the new treatments?
Yeah, so Claudin-18 is a biomarker, and we have found that it is expressed in certain cancer types and only in the tumor cells. So that's the key in identifying a drug target, is that it's exclusively expressed in the tumor cells, and it's part of the disease course. So we want to target that because it's different from normal cells. And in pancreatic cancer, which has been very hard to treat and typically only treated with chemotherapies, and immunotherapy hasn't worked there, and you typically diagnose it when it's very advanced and spread all throughout the body, which makes it harder to treat. So identifying these targets for which we have good drugs to target is so important for these hard to treat cancers, and it has the potential to change the course of treating the paradigm of pancreatic cancer treatment. So it's very hopeful. And we at Caris are at the forefront of keeping on top of all of these new biomarkers to be able to make sure that we're reporting them and testing for it, because sometimes you need very specific platforms to identify that they're present or not. So Claudin-18 specifically is detected by immunohistochemistry, and it has to be read by a pathologist who's trained on how to interpret the expression of it in tumor cells, and we are able to provide that for our patients. So it's very important.
Wow, incredible. We're hearing a lot more about advanced therapies like Bispecifics and ADCs, basically treatments that are more precise and powerful. How does Caris's molecular profiling help match the right patients to these new therapies, especially in rare or underserved cancer types?
Yeah, so making sure that we are, again, testing for it by the right analyte. So is it sequencing and we're looking for mutations? Is it in the RNA and that we need to look for fusions? Is it expression that we can only detect by immunohistochemistry? So Caris is keeping on top of what is important for cancer patients, and from my perspective of ensuring that our reports that go out to oncologists, I need to make sure that the right target is presented on the report correctly and in the right patient population, right? So we always have to have something to hang our hat on in terms of evidence that supports the biomarker and the treatment efficacy. And that's typically in peer-reviewed publications and clinical trial options.
It's so fascinating because hearing you talk, I realize we are in the future.
Yes.
Like we are no longer in 20 years ago. We are no longer in 5 years ago even. We are really in the future. One of the exciting areas that being talked about a lot at ASCO is new drug combinations, like immunotherapy with other types of drugs to improve results. How does Caris help identify which patients might respond to these combos, especially when science is complicated and there's multiple mutations or biomarkers?
It's really the devil's in the details for presenting the right drug option for each patient. And you're right, sometimes it is a combination of results that would qualify a patient for a certain therapy option. But Caris also, we're dependent on what becomes FDA approved And so these combinations are slowly coming to the forefront and getting FDA approved as viable clinical treatment options. But we also match to clinical trials of these novel combinations. So it has to go through the process of clinical validation, and a lot of these options are in clinical trials. And one other way that Caris is also looking into these combination strategies is through our signature development efforts on the research side, and identifying what patients would benefit from the combination strategy and what patients could avoid a combination strategy and are better off just receiving a single agent, which is much better in terms of side effects, right? So do you want one drug or two drugs? Well, I'd rather just have one drug, right? So that's another way that we're approaching this combination treatment strategy.
So fascinating. So I would be remiss to not ask you about the AI question. Tech like AI, blood-based DNA testing, it's becoming a bigger part of cancer care and clinical trials. So how is Caris using tools like AI or ctDNA to improve how we understand cancer, choose treatments, or design smarter trials?
Yeah, so this is a big trend right now, and right in its time, right? Technology is advancing, and after 15, 20 years of collecting data on patients that matches molecular profile results with their treatments and how well they responded or not, we're now at a point where we have big data sets, right, to match the biomarkers and with the clinical efficacy. So it's really about harmonizing the data now and making sure that patient from 15 years ago is the same as the patient that we have today with the same biomarkers, right? So harmonizing that data is the first step. And then with real world data sets also, we have to make a lot of assumptions, and there's sometimes gaps in the data. So I think, why it's taking a while to go to the next step of AI is just making sure that the data cohorts that we develop these signatures on is clean and it makes sense. And that's really going to improve the signature development process. So Caris definitely has a lot of efforts in that arena as well.
Absolutely. And I wanted to ask you today, while I had you, a lot of healthcare consumers, especially kids or people with rare mutations, haven't had many clinical trial options in the past. And how are you really opening those doors by identifying those trial markers and moving those things forward?
Yeah, there are a lot of underserved populations, pediatrics and rare disease tumor types, but we're really dependent on science and clinical validation. But one recent example of something becoming clinically validated is another biomarker called MAGE-A4, which is pertinent to a very rare sarcoma, synovial sarcoma, and it became FDA approved. And it's so rare that a lot of big companies probably wouldn't test this biomarker because it just doesn't make sense, I guess, economically. But for Caris, we go by the mom rule, and we want to make sure that if there is a valid treatment and there's a target that we can test for, we're going to do it because it's the right thing for the patient. That's an example, but really we need to harness our big data sets and research efforts to identify these novel biomarkers that can become targeted. And I think that's where a lot of the biotech and pharmaceutical companies are pointing a lot of their efforts to right now. But when it comes to developing biomarkers, it's really hard for these rare tumor types because companies may not want to invest in those because it's such a small patient population, but we are making some strides in that direction. And so that's one recent example of something that happened recently, and it's very important.
So inspiring. As we're wrapping up this part of the interview, talking about ASCO, if you had to pick one or a few studies at ASCO this year that really shows where cancer care is going, what do you think is kind of the most impactful and how, that's going to really matter for patients and caregivers?
That's a really hard question to pick out one study, but there's one or two themes that are really very important for the future. And that is the big data, AI, and developing novel signatures to identify patterns of patients that would benefit or not benefit from a certain agent. And then the other thing is like early detection with our liquid profiling and ctDNA. If we can detect cancer before it's spread and harder to treat, then that in itself is a win as well. So I think those themes today and in the future is going to really change the direction of cancer care.
Wow. Now, HITea with Grace wants to understand trends that are happening in the space, but we also love to learn about women and healthcare IT and what drives them and what keeps them going. You are a hardworking, successful woman. And I'm wondering, what are things that you do in your daily life to work your best and make a difference?
In my daily life, I think it's just being inspired by the patients and just really caring for each individual patient that is going through their journey with their patient or with their families. And I do really care. So I think that inspiration is what drives me on a daily basis. In terms of what do I do on a daily basis, it's just maybe reading the latest publications and staying on top of the news and the developments of new biomarkers and new therapies that would be available. And that way I can direct my team to research certain things to make sure that we're covering everything on our clinical reports.
Absolutely. And if you could give your younger self a piece of advice when you're thinking about your career and the path that you took, like what advice would you give your younger self?
I would say get exposure to different fields early so that you can figure out what you like and what you don't like. Because I think that's what I did, expose myself to laboratory research and to hospital settings, like volunteered like throughout high school and college. And getting exposure to those fields is so important because then you have more experience to guide your decisions that will decide the trajectory of your life. So I think exposure and volunteering opportunities and just signing up for job aids in a laboratory, those are the things that are going to expose you to things that you otherwise wouldn't know about.
Absolutely. And as we think about the future of the industry, and I think that's very true. I hope everybody hears that and really exposes themselves to so many different sides. But so we think of, to wrap this up, and we think of the future of the industry, what are the biggest challenges and what are the biggest opportunities in this biomarker space?
Probably harmonizing efforts between different stakeholders. We have the US FDA, we have regulatory systems, we have consensus groups like the NCCN, we have biotech, we have pharmaceutical, we have academia, we have biotech. I think I said that already, but I think harmonizing the efforts to ensure that the data that we're collecting is going to be able to be used to get us to the next step, which is probably the AI and big data and identifying patterns of patients and which patients respond to therapies better. So I think that's probably a goal for the entire field.
Very exciting. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Feldman, for joining me today. It was awesome having you on the show.
Thank you as well. Thank you.
And thanks to you folks for joining us too. Check out the HITea with Grace podcast website for more great guests like Rebecca today. Cheers.
Like a Girl Media is more than a media network. It's a community. We want to meet you and amplify your voice and the voices of outstanding women innovating in healthcare. Interested in starting your own podcast or hosting an event near you? Connect with us online or in person. We're here to support and empower you.